Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to RAC Art Talks series. RAC is the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. I'm Jing Han, the director of this institute. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded lands of the Baramatical people of the Darug Nation, who are the traditional owners of their lands for thousands of years, and pay our respect to the First Nations elders, past and present. Our guest speaker for lecture number 3 in the second series of RAC Art Talks is Dr. Cindy Yuanze Chen, an early career artist and academic working between drawing, listening, and sound. We had the honor and delight to feature Cindy's beautiful works in our group show in 2021. If you joined this webinar a bit earlier, you will have had the chance to hear a piece of music played on the pen by Multi Martin that Cindy has chosen, as she likes to listen to it when drawing. It's just so beautiful. Now we're all hooked onto this music. Cindy says the music possesses similar timbre and frequencies as the Tibetan and Nepalese singing bowls. Cindy completed her PhD at the University of New South Wales in Art and Design in 2020 and presented her research internationally in England and China. She was selected as a finalist for the 2021-22 New South Wales Visual Arts Emerging Fellowship, Hazelhurst Art on Paper Award in 2021-22 and 2023. Cindy has been commissioned for solo exhibitions nationally and internationally by institutions such as the 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art at the Australian National Maritime Museum in 2022, Willoughby City Council in 2021, and the Ningbo Museum of Art in China in 2018. In an expansion of her creative practice, Cindy was invited to curate Lunar New Year public programs for the Art Gallery of New South Wales in 2023 and debuted a sound feedback live performance in the Essential Tremors Festival at Phoenix Central Park in 2022. With her multidisciplinary practice, Cindy investigates the fascinating trajectories of cultural exchange and transformation that have occurred through intergenerational migration, trade, and colonization in Southeast Asia, specifically in Malaysia, where she was born. Her talk today will explore her engagement with East Asian ink practices and Chinese landscape painting through materials, visual elements, and composition, and how integrating this with contemporary drawing, listening, and sound practices occurs. Now, please welcome Dr. Cindy Yuanze Chen to give her talk, Articulating Trajectories, Connecting with the Chinese Heritage Through Drawing and Listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Han. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I'd like to begin also by acknowledging that I'm dialing in from the land of the Darramuraga people and the Gamaragal people here in Marsfield, Sydney, New South Wales. And I honor their ancestors, acknowledge their continuing sovereignty on this land, and extend my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for your wonderful introduction, Professor Han. And I will start by sharing my screen. And today's talk goes through the trajectory of my work through 3 key phases. So starting from around 2012, when I was beginning to undertake, well, actually, I'd finished my master's research through to my PhD, and then the current research that I'm embarking on, some of which you see behind me. So I'm just in my studio, so please excuse the the tape. These are works in progress. And so I'll just share my screen and presentation now. Okay, so I've called this presentation Articulating Trajectories because I feel like this is what I have been trying to do continuously throughout my practice over the last 10 years or so, trying to understand where I've come from and where I'm going. And also looking back now on the trajectories of my ancestors as well. So I wanted to begin by sharing a paragraph that I started my PhD with, because I feel that it encapsulates, I guess, the core motivations that underlie why I create and make art. So I wrote in my thesis prelude, I said, I have always found it hard to say with absolute certainty that there was a place that had a hold on me. This could have been the effect of having moved from Malaysia to Australia when I was 4. Perhaps that is why I turned towards looking at visually iconic places in Australia and China, places that had been made known to me through idyllic paintings. This constituted an attempt to find cultural emplacement through images and imagery. And I feel like looking back at that statement, I realized just how much it encapsulates a sense of in-betweenness, a sense of loss in a way as well, and also a sense of searching. And I feel that this is quite potentially something that is shared by many migrant peoples. I'm second, third, and fourth generation Malaysian-born Chinese, and my ancestors are mostly Hakka, although my grandmother was born in Guangdong province, and Hakka people in China is internally displaced as well. So our true ancestral homelands around the Yellow River Delta region is even further back. So the ancestral homelands that I can connect with now are what I know from my grandparents on both sides. So I think that this experience of disconnection, of growing up in Australia since I was 4, and upon reaching university and being educated at the College of Fine Arts, as it was then known, at the University of New South Wales, I was primarily exposed to Western literature, Western ways of thinking. I think I dream primarily in English. So there was a sense of wanting to connect to the past. So even though I grew up hearing Hakka at home, hearing some Cantonese, and having my parents speak to me in Mandarin, my actual reading level of Chinese is like that of a 4-year-old, because that's when I left. And unfortunately, I was not very studious in Chinese school in Sydney. I found it really, really boring. But now I'm going back and learning, learning things again. So in 2008, when I was beginning my master's research, and I came across this painting by Musi Fa-Chang, if I pronounce his name correctly. I was just blown away. And it resonated with me on a level that I think was so deep. It was like seeing something deeply, deeply familiar that I'd seen before. And this work, Yan Si Wan Zhong, it's from the 8 Views of Xiaoxiang, so Xiaoxiang Ba Jing. And it's a very iconic series in Chinese landscape painting history. And this work was made in the late Southern Song Dynasty. I think what really amazed me about this piece was how the artist had expressed resonance through ink on paper. It was just the most simple, essential mediums of Chinese East Asian culture. And these bands of ink, these washes, almost no outline. I could almost feel the sound of the bell resonating through the mist to me. And at that time, I was already very interested in sound. And that's something that has continued through my practice. And sound is something that I feel touches us very deeply. It's something that we respond to on a visceral level. And trying to connect with that visually has been something that I've continually returned to. So Muqi, he was unfortunately forgotten in China for a while. He wasn't very highly regarded in the Yuan dynasty, but his works were taken over to Japan, and he was highly influential upon the Chan or Zen Buddhist monks. So Seishu Toyo, his Winter Landscape is another piece that I saw, and I feel like these are moments where your life trajectory just completely changes. So seeing this work and then seeing Seishu Toyo's piece, and then finally this work by Hasegawa Tohaku, who was from the Kano school, but who was also studied the works of Mushi in the temples in Kyoto. And this is a work that whenever my husband and I are in Japan in New Year's, I have to visit the Tokyo National Museum and I have to see this work. It's often, because it depicts pine trees, it's used to celebrate New Year's. And again, there's a sense of resonance in this work and of sound bouncing through space that really captures my imagination. So these pieces, this sense of space in them, that sense of unfolding and of things permeating through space is something that I hadn't encountered in my Western training. So I've been trained mainly in Western drawing practices and looking at things through perspective, especially single point perspective. So allowing space and allowing suggestiveness of space to create a sense of wonder is something that really spoke to me. And of course, there's also the work of Guan Daosheng, who she's one of the very, very few female artists who were recognized in their time. So she was a scholar, painter, poet, and she was living and painting during the Yuan dynasty. And her work, A Bamboo Grove in Mist, which also is a long scroll that also has a poetry and calligraphy as part of it. It's just one of the most beautiful works that, again, is so suggestive of rhythm. And so these pieces with this sense of unrolling narrative and connecting to an artwork on such an intimate level was something that really inspired me and really carried through into my master's research. So this work here is from 2011, and it's one of my pieces from my master's research, where I was looking at Buddhist chantings from the Theravada tradition. So I mainly connect with Buddhist chanting through Theravada Pali chants because I'm able to read the chanting because it's translated in English, and Chinese chanting has been translated from Pali to Chinese, and so the meaning is a little bit hard for me to grasp. So Theravada Buddhist chants are really how I connect with Buddhism. And this work here harks back to the compositional, I guess, traits of all of the previous pieces that I had mentioned. So that space of resonance, it uses sound waves from the Buddhist chants. So I was using recordings of Buddhist chants, putting them through programs and using printouts of those chants to then arrange these compositions. And this is a detail from this. And so the way that I work with the brush is very unorthodox, I would say. I actually use I split the brush hairs. Well, I don't split them individually, but rather than using like a single point, like how usually you would paint, and or use calligraphy, I actually like to gently separate them. And I think that I always say that this would make a painter or a calligrapher cry. But this is how I achieve the really, really fine marks that you see. And I wanted to express the ephemerality of sound and to have a boneless quality, which is something that which he is well known for, and it's what artists have kind of continued in his tradition in Japan as well. So this was something that continued for many years. I was looking at sound and also recording sound. So I began recording sounds of nature. This one was actually made from recordings of thunder. And I was also looking at paintings of dragons on byobu or screens, Japanese screens and folding screens. And I was looking at the compositions with dragons, because dragons are connected with thunder, rain. So all of these atmospheric events in Chinese mythology, and I was wanting to make these connections with nature as well. So these pieces here also employ grids. So I use the grid form, and it means that this work is actually quite, it ends up being quite two-dimensional in a way. I struggled with depth quite a fair bit in my practice. And so when I started moving into my PhD practice, I began to develop a more embodied and sculptural approach. And in 2016 is when I began my PhD, but I began visiting China in 2017 and also 2018. And I was wanting to connect with the Xiaoxiang region, which is primarily historically located in Hunan, but I wasn't able to find a place I could stay. and so when I was searching, I found that Lijiang in Guangxi Autonomous Region, the headwaters of Lijiang River actually flow into the Xiaoxiang region. And I was like, okay, that's my connection. And so I found this beautiful village called Langshuchun, and there was an Airbnb there that had a Qing dynasty house that had been preserved, and it had been converted into an Airbnb. And I stayed there for a couple of months on 2 different occasions, and I developed a methodology through drawing, listening, and sounding. So it's very much about connecting with the landscape by being embodied within the place. And so my propositions were connecting with places in Australia and China, so iconic places in Australia. So I went to Hill End in Australia, and that's an area that was painted by Russell Drysdale, but it was also an area that was greatly shaped by Chinese miners as well. So that was another part of my PhD, which I won't talk about today. But then I also focused on places in China that had very iconic visual imagery, but wanting to connect with it in a very embodied and situated approach. So these were my propositions, where I was looking at how dynamic processes can enact the unfolding of places, and looking at how listening and sounding can also transform drawing practice by extending the ideas of surface, gesture, line, and mark making. Now, I also wanted to acknowledge that I was visiting this place in China, and it was 2017 was the first time I'd ever visited China. And it was an opportunity to practice my Mandarin. But also, I came to realize when I was in Langshu that my understanding, the perspective that I brought was inherently Western. So in terms of the philosophical and academic perspective that I brought, and I really needed to acknowledge this in my research. And I also wanted to acknowledge that the Chinese tradition of shanshui had developed as a very distinct tradition has its own philosophical, spiritual beliefs. And anything that I was writing, especially if it was thinking about it in a Western context, essentially sets up a kind of writing that is Western in intent. And I mention here with this quote from James Elkin, who talks about this and in discussing how comparing historical perspectives is essentially done from very much a Western viewpoint. So this was really important, especially when I was connecting with places, and I approached this this project by examining the visual tropes of Chinese landscape, because that is how that is what I had known, and that is what how I had connected with the landscape in China prior to physically being there. So I looked at how Northern Song Dynasty scholar, official, and poet Su Shi, he spoke of how painting and poetry were deeply interconnected, and they were one single discipline. But he also mentioned that mountains, rocks, bamboo, shadows, waves, and mists, they convey qi in nature, and that sense of energy in nature. And I wanted to really focus on these elements, these visual tropes of mountains, rocks, bamboo, and to think about how I could connect with this as a woman in the 21st century. And not only that, a person who for more than 2 generations had not actually been born in China. So through drawing, drawing with paper in the water, rubbing paper against stones. This was from my first visit in 2017, both of these process images, to walking up and down the mountains and playing with that idea of a scroll. I was able to recontextualize and reimagine my role as an artist, and as an artist who was working with traditional Chinese mediums of ink and paper and connecting with these iconic elements of Chinese painting. And I also looked at the idea of the scroll, because I loved how with scrolls are so intimate, and they represent, or they articulate, I should say, an unfolding of a story. And curator Chang Zongzong, I'm not sure if I pronounced his name correctly, Johnson Chang, he's based in Hong Kong. He talked about how encountering Chinese scrolls requires a you, so like a wandering, and also a reading as well. So I love that sense of wandering, and I wanted to wander in this place. And I also wanted to create something that I didn't have to turn over when I was drawing. So I thought of a Mobius strip. So Mobius loops are quite remarkable in that they have a single surface. So it's essentially, it's a loop of paper that has a twist in it. And this was inspired by my reading of feminist theorist Elizabeth Gross, where she talks about the Mobius strip and how it leads one from the outside to the inside, and ins and outs are deeply connected. And it became a metaphor for these perceptual engagements. And so I was walking back and forth, and this scroll was made while walking along the river and climbing up the mountains. So I was climbing up these pathways that people were climbing for hundreds of years. So the stones were worn smooth by people's feet, and that's how you know they're on the right path. And I was also going into the mountains, and in 2018, I started using these loops in a different way. I was creating sound. So this is after I had started working with sound feedback. So here I was actually rubbing paper against the rock and gathering these moss onto the paper. And at the same time, using these speakers and the microphones that I attached to my wrist, I was able to actually create sound at particular locations. So I had to find where the sound would bounce back to me between these rocks. And the sound of paper rubbing against the rocks would come out of those speakers, bounce off the rocks, and I'd catch them again with the microphones on my wrists. So this allowed me to generate a sense of being within this environment and to consider my embodiment within this environment, how I was generating these perceptual processes. Now, these created beautiful paper sculptures that I'll show in a couple of minutes what the final product looked like. But it also meant that I was affecting other people's experiences of these places. And this required an ethical consideration. So when I was in Langshu, one of the sounds that really bothered me was actually the sound of these boats. So Lijiang, it just looks so beautiful. You look at it in pictures, but then when you're actually there, from the break of dawn, there's these loud motors of people transporting the children to school, going to the markets. And I was like, oh no, this completely, ruptures my sense of what this place should be like. And so I was just trying to avoid it as much as I could. And I was going into the mountains. So my first visit, I was just like escaping, going into the mountains and spending time with the cows and the goats and the monkeys up in the mountains. And then I realized that I wasn't actually engaging realistically with this place in the 21st century. I was still very stuck in a mode of this kind of scholarly elite. I wanted to create this sense of this idyllic place. And then so I decided to go down to the mountains at dawn one morning, as early as I could before those motors started. And I encountered women washing their families' clothing and bedding at the river. And it's really interesting because speaking to my local hosts, I asked them, why were people still doing this? Because they have washing machines now. And he said that they didn't feel that their clothes were clean enough in the being washed by washing machines. And this totally didn't make sense to me because down at the river, you actually have these trails of oil from the boats, and the rocks are covered in mud. And also further up the river, I knew that there were villages where some of their sewage was going into the river as well. And so I was thinking, this is really fascinating. There's this deep connection to the land that just cannot be broken. And you might notice, so just at where in the smaller picture, where the blue bucket is, and there's the woman in the striped shirt. Now that stone has been used so much over generations for washing clothing that it's worn completely smooth. So that's where people know to go to wash the clothes. And I realized that that by avoiding this, I was actually also bringing very much an outsider's perspective, and I had to. It was really important for me to consider this as well. And so just to mention, so this is something else that I had also written in my observations. I said, although I was fluent enough to speak to this local woman to ask for permission to include her laundry percussion in my sound feedback, there was still a distance between our individual relationships to Langshu as a place. For her, the mountains and rivers were a pragmatic source of daily sustenance, and unwittingly participating in my process of drawing was just a small blip in her morning routine. So she didn't fully understand what I was doing. I was trying to explain it to her, but it wasn't really of interest to her. So, but for me, listening to her interactions with the river and responding with my own sound feedback wove a new way of responding to the Shantre tradition into the existing fabric of Langshu. And it allowed me to engage in what was predominantly a female space of activity So I did see men engaging and washing clothes along the river. But at dawn, it was mostly women there, and they'd be there with huge buckets and they'd be washing bedding as well as their clothing. So I just couldn't understand how they were manipulating these huge pieces of fabric. But I wanted to play for you a piece of the recording that I had made. Can you hear that? Yes. So the hums and the sort of whoo, and then the ringing that you hear in the background, that's the sound that has been created by these rocks. And I have to find what I call the sweet spot for these beautiful like reverberations to occur. And the sound of the thumping was actually the woman using these bamboo sticks to hit the cloth. So that's how they I think got the water out of the fabric. And so I was imitating these motions of hitting the paper and scrubbing the paper with a brush and ink in order to create pieces like this. So this tiny little scroll ball of paper expanded into quite a long loop, and so it was actually double layered, and it ended up kind of separating from its loop. And then this one, which was made in the mountain and created just by rubbing the paper against the rock, that also has a sound work attached to it, and the marks were generated from the moss. So these processes also included, actually painting with bamboo leaves, and then this one I made sound recordings by of the sound of bamboo rubbing against paper, and I'd created these fan-like structures. They weren't meant to be fans. I was thinking more of musical instruments, but I wanted to be able to draw on two sides at the same time and to create something that was that corresponded to the size of my body. So the pieces for Lang Shi Xiang, so mountain river bamboo, these were displayed in a performative context as well. So and with the sound playing as a part of the installation. So this was my way of, I guess, reinterpreting what shan shui could be through an embodied perspective that incorporated listening as well, and listening, drawing, and sounding. So I used the sound also later on to create another body of work that was exhibited at the Australian National Maritime Museum with 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art. So that was a commission by 4A, curated by Con Jarakaris. And I created a space that was actually dedicated to women. So I really wanted to look at how women, and looking back at the river, you don't see women scrubbing clothing in, in chantry paintings, although they're there. They've been there for hundreds of years, and you can see how shiny the rocks are because they've been there for so long, scrubbing clothes, but they're largely ignored. And so I wanted to create my own little garden for women to converse and talk. And so I interviewed 3 women identifying artists, and then I also created new scrolls using ink and scrubbing brushes as my my tools. And then I also created video works that used the scrunched up paper that had been wrung in ink and twisted and scrubbed to create these little landscapes in a video work. So that was a further iteration of this piece. So I also wanted to acknowledge a key influence of a contemporary artist. So Bing Yi, whom Louise Guest has written about, and I've included Louise's work in my PhD as well. That this artist is she's based in Beijing and also LA, I believe, and she's an artist who also works very much in an embodied way within the landscape. So she produces video works, but also incredibly from tiny, intricate, fine. I would say that they're like gongbi, like really fine drawings and paintings, through to these large scale pieces that she can really get physically embed herself into. So she was a core influence in my thinking as well. Now, just because we're running short on time, I also really wanted to share with you more recent developments as well. So this is my new research project, and we're kind of entering into uncharted waters here in terms of my thinking processes. So I'm still in the making process and researching process, and then I'll need to reflect on it and kind of make sense on it after I create. So I had mentioned earlier that my family are of Hakka and Cantonese ancestry, and I'm 2nd, 3rd, and 4th generation Malaysian-born Chinese. Now, this body of work has been in my mind for over a decade, but it's taken a long time for me to, I guess, attain the conceptual finesse and conceptual skills to be able to address this. And now I finally feel ready. Although the technical skills also needed to develop, these methods of drawing, I think, have always been inherent within me. However, like the work that you see here, which I call Apos Sarang Kabaya, this is currently on display at a single piece gallery in Surrey Hills, and the last day was on Saturday. But this work had required a lot of experimentation as well. It's made using Chinese and Japanese ink and also pen on watercolor paper. And it responds to my grandmother's cultural garments. So this is a photo of my grandparents here. And although my grandmother she was born in Penang in Malaysia. So Penang was Britain's first settlement or colony in Southeast Asia. Francis Light landed in 1786. I remember that. And the British settlements actually opened pathways for Chinese immigrants. And although Chinese people and Chinese trade had occurred since the 15th century, which led to the Peranakan culture, which is very rich in Singapore, Malacca, and Penang. So Penang is where my maternal family are primarily based. It was really the industries of tin mining and trade that were governed by the British that led to huge influxes of Chinese people in the 19th and 20th centuries, of which my family were part of. Now, my grandparents, my grandmother on the right and my grandfather on the left, they were born in the 1930s in Penang. And at that time, Penang was very much extremely cosmopolitan. And my grandmother, I just always think back of how my first memory as a baby was actually of light shining through sarongs and seeing the patterns of these vibrant floral patterns and shapes being illuminated by these typically Southeast Asian fluorescent lights. And I'd see these, and I still have a really strong memory of this. And it never occurred to me that this wasn't a Chinese garment. It wasn't a traditionally Chinese garment. And looking back at these photos, I realized, oh, actually, my grandmother, I always saw her in formal events in the Cheongsam, but every day she wore sarongs and she wore kabayas. And I've always wanted to investigate, well, why? You know, what is the significance of this garment? And I'll go back to this in a moment, but this is a section of one of her sarongs that I'm really happy my mum found in the cupboard here, and it's an actual batik sarong, and this is a detail of one of her kabayas, which is a more contemporary kabaya. Now the kabaya is actually a cultural garment that's worn by women across Southeast Asia. So it's a national cultural garment in Indonesia, Brunei, and also in Malaysia as well. So you see this in Singapore Airlines outfits, Malaysian Airlines. They're just different modernized versions. So it's evolved through centuries, and it's thought that maybe the Portuguese might have brought it over, or it also has origins, Islamic origins as well. So the name kabak, so developed into kabaya. So it's a tunic that's worn by men and women. But then the Peranakan Chinese people, so the Peranakan people are descended from Chinese men who migrated to Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand as well. And they intermarried with local women because women weren't really allowed to travel at that time. And these unique communities and cultures emerged. And so they retained these like Chinese traditions from the 15th century, 15th and 16th centuries. But they also integrated it with local cultures. So in Penang, you have these Nyonya Baba people. So the Nyonya are the women, the Baba are the men, and Nyonya women would wear these really elaborate kabaya. And so my grandmother, she wore this day to day as a way of connecting with where she was born. And it was also in a way connecting with this hybrid Chinese culture that had emerged. Now, what I love about this most recent kabaya is the addition of the Chinese punko knots. So it became even more Chinese. So that was really quite fascinating. And the Chinese kabayas also had all of these beautiful floral patterns that were very distinct to Chinese tastes or Peranakan Chinese tastes. Now, I've included these shots just because this is how I connect to my cultural homelands now. It's through YouTube and through Google and through online images. So this is my maternal ancestral homeland, so Guanning County. So I really want to visit these places in the near future. And Yongding, Fujian is where my father's side are from. So they're both places that are really important or significant to China or to Hakka communities. And what I love about Guanning, I recently found out that it's one of the homes of bamboo. So there's hundreds of acres of ecologically protected areas with all of these species of bamboo. And so these have led to my most recent body of work. So this is another piece with my grandmother's garments. And then I created a larger, a paper version of one of her kabayas, and I elongated the collar, and I painted it with satellite vision of mountains in Guanning. So I used printouts of mountains in Guanning to paint this piece, and it's done with Chinese ink on paper. Now, lastly, I wanted to just give an indication of where this research is heading as well, and also where it had emerged from. So earlier in this year, there were a couple of moments that really led to, I guess, a bit of a rupture in my thinking and my understanding. And one of those was actually, firstly, seeing my grandfather's coin collection, which I have photos of behind me, but then also coming across just randomly this video of archival footage of Singapore in the 19th century. And it was a moment that was psychologically painful in a way, because I realized I wrote in my diary what this meant to me. So seeing films of Chinese people in the 1900s from the British Film Institute created a fragmentation in my mind. 90% of visual and literary culture that's burnt into my eyeballs and brains has been Western-centric. But now there's a stripping away of this accumulated mental imagery that is incongruous with my ancestral history. And there's a rupture, a tear, and a confused sense of loss. And so it's really interesting, because it has really required me to dig into thinking about, well, what was life really like for my ancestors? Because they weren't like the people in Jane Austen and Dickens films from BBC dramas that I've been looking at. No, they were living very different lives. And so these stills, of these men eating, and very young boy eating at the front, and this little girl in the back who's obviously not allowed to eat until the men have finished eating. It's something that was really, really, it was quite confronting for me to experience. And this led me to investigate archives. So colonial archives are actually quite valuable, even though there are, the ethnographic approach of these is quite questionable. But I found in the Musée de Quai Branly, Jacques Chirac, which is in Paris, but they have online archives. I found these images of Chinese tin mines in Perak. And these are the mines that my great-grandparents would have worked in. So my great-grandfathers, my grandmother also worked in these mines before she was married. So these are the kinds of landscapes that I'm thinking about now. And my maternal grandfather's coins, so you saw a photo of him earlier, he couldn't read or write, or he never went to school. I think he could read some English and some Chinese. He started working at the age of 6, but he actually collected coins his whole life. He was fascinated. And these coins, so the Chinese coin here from the Chen dynasty, it's from 1735 to 1796. Sorry, 1795. And I'm not sure where he got them from, but he's got coins from the Dutch, French, and Spanish colonies as well. And he's actually obviously looked at all the monarchs from Queen Victoria through to Elizabeth II. And also here, there's a really interesting coin from the Republic of China from the 1920s. So it's evidence of just how cosmopolitan Penang was, and also how like Sun Yat-sen, he actually took refuge in Penang, and there's actually a museum to him in Penang as well. So I find it really interesting how these trace different histories, and these photographs that I've taken will form the basis for the next series of drawings. And I've very carefully chosen coins based on their dates as well. So these coins here are from World War II and the dates of the Japanese occupation in Malaysia. And so, yes, this is my ongoing series of works, and this is a little study that I've done that will lead to more drawings. So that was a very long talk, and I'm sure there are lots of questions. But thank you very much for bearing with me. And there's a lot of information there. And please send through your questions, and I'll do my best to answer. And let me just...
Thank you so much, Cindy. It's a fascinating. It's a truly fascinating. Fascinating in the sense of, like, you take us through to see the world we didn't see before. The sound, the connection between sound and a visual, and also those details. It's just incredible. And you must have this very super sensitive mind and hearing and eyes. It's just incredible. I'm fascinated and mesmerized by what you see. And I will start with a question. So anyone who have questions, just to start posting on Q&A. My first question, because as you mentioned that you were born in Malaysia of a Chinese heritage, and you didn't really learn Chinese very well. I can relate to that. My children still not that interested yet. So hopefully one day they will be like you. So when was the moment, like epiphany? And to say, oh, actually Chinese culture or Chinese landscape painting or Chinese language itself, it's interesting.
Mm. I, I I really think it was that moment that I saw the Yan Si Wan Zhong, the painting by Mu Fa Chang. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly, but that painting really triggered it for me. And I was looking through. I still remember sitting there in the library at art school and seeing these books, and I was flicking through them. All of these Chan and Zen Buddhist paintings of ink on paper. And I think seeing the ink on paper and seeing the energy of the calligraphy was really pivotal. I felt like I could feel the trajectory of the artist's hands. And I think that's the power of calligraphy. You can really see the trace and of where the hands have been and the journey that the brush has gone on. And I think from that time and I realizing how the only access that I had to this information was very much through translated texts. That has really made me acknowledge how much I have missed out on. And so I feel like especially when I talk to my father, because he taught in English, sorry, not in English, in Chinese. And the Malaysian education system is one where throughout the generations, you could either study in Chinese school, and then in my uncle was a teenager in the 70s, it suddenly switched all to Malay. It was really hard. So there was a split where some people learned traditional, could learn Chinese, and people couldn't. And then, of course, for my generation, coming to Australia when I was 4, for my parents, my father was able to teach us some characters, but my mother never studied at a Chinese school. So she, strangely enough, she taught Chinese in primary school so in Australia. So she actually had to go back and learn as well. So I think that was the key moment. But then since then, trying to slowly learn and to develop it. And strangely enough, learning now especially learning Chinese characters, I mainly focus on traditional characters because I'm learning also Japanese through my husband. And so he actually reads more Chinese. He's able to read and recognize more Chinese characters than I can. So when we went to China, when we went to Taiwan and Hong Kong, he was the one reading and, reading all the signs and directions, and I was doing the speaking. So together we could make a whole.
Work it out. Fascinating. In relation to that question, you mentioned you were educated in Western culture and Western art and Western history and Western thinking. And then when you start looking at the Chinese and Asian heritage and the culture, you can't doing this unlearning thing. So, so that you can have a space in your mind to taking a different way of thinking. How did you find that unlearning process?
I feel like the unlearning is something that is still ongoing because, and I always have this sense that there's almost a screen between me and the information that I'm trying to access. And that is very much due to this language barrier. And I feel like this unlearning has required at first an understanding of my position as a researcher and as an artist. And I think a really important part of this is actually being able to go and experience places and to talk to people and to be part of community for a little bit. So one moment of unlearning was actually talking to a local woman, and my housemate and I were exclaiming, the beauties of this incredible landscape in Langshu. And she said to us, it's only because you don't live here that you can see how beautiful it is. And she mentioned a phrase, 靠山吃山，靠水吃水. And I'd not heard that before. But that made me realize that it's actually almost impossible for me to strip back the ways of thinking unless I actually am in a place and I learn from people. So cultural transmission needs to happen directly. I feel like it can't really happen through books. It needs to be lived. So this process will be ongoing, and it will only be able to occur if I can be in those places and within those communities.
So well said. Yes, exactly. The Guilin, when I took my children were there, with whichever way we turn around, so it's a beautiful picture. But the people living there, they carry on as if nothing, extraordinary. So yes, I know what you said to make perfect sense. I go to audience now, and I have a few more questions, but I'll get the audience to ask. Louisa Guest, Dr. Louisa Guest had a question. Such a fascinating presentation, Cindy. I'm so interested to see how your new body of work will develop. Do you think you will include sound in these works as well?
Actually, I have ambitions and hopes of going to places. So one of the reasons I shared an image of Guanning and Yongding Fujian is because I would really love to make bodies of works in my ancestral homelands. So I'd love to visit the Hakatulo and to record sounds there, and to engage bodily and to create sound feedback within those rammed earth structures, and to be in those bamboo groves in Guanning and along the riverbanks to create sound. But what I have access to now, primarily through the coins, is using these the histories inherent within these coins as starting points for connecting to places. So I'd really like to go to Georgetown, Malaysia, to Ipoh, and to look also at the colonial history. So I find that for Chinese diaspora, our recent histories, especially of the 20th centuries, are so deeply entangled with the colonial projects in Southeast Asia. So for instance, the experience of the Communist Revolution, for instance, or the Cultural Revolution. In Malaysia, it was very much the Chinese-led communist guerrillas that actually my father's family were part of in Ipoh. And so that was entangled with the British. So I really want to connect with these places and to do sound recordings and to potentially do video works that would emerge from these stories. And yes, yeah, I feel like this is a project that will take the next 20 or 30 years for me to achieve.
I know when I'm hearing you, oh, this is so fascinating, interesting. I'm thinking, oh, we should clone Cindy, have several Cindy doing all this. Wendy Hu has a comment, which I totally agree. Wendy said, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I feel that your use of all the senses to experience the landscape have more than compensated for your limited Chinese language. And I truly agree. And I have a question before I go back to the audience. Shapes of your artworks is vital, like every piece of work, you do have different shapes. Some seems like, random shape, but none is actually a random shape. And some have a perfect shape. How do you decide the shape? And then the shapes reflect what parts? Yeah.
Yes. So I guess the visual composition of my works and the forms that emerge from the processes, some of them are quite deliberate. So for instance, the early compositions with the sound waves, they were very deliberately created or developed by looking at the sound waves. However, the PhD research, which was very process driven, that created a rupture in my sense of composition. So I really that was a process of unlearning, actually. That was a breaking apart of actively composing things and allowing the process to generate the form. So the scrolls, or the Mobius loops, I should say, that emerge from scrolls, their forms are very much determined by what they had encountered. So like say the mountain, moss, or the river, like being washed in the river, and then I do arrange them. So I do kind of place them and I arrange them, and I do think about mountainous forms when I do that. And the more recent pieces where I have scrolls that are suspended and they're various heights, and even of the small pieces in the video works, which are like scrunched paper, that was very carefully considered by thinking about how I could evoke a sense of scholars' rocks in gardens. And so those forms and the rocks, I always kind of connect back to nature in some way. And even in the compositions of the drawings that I'm doing. So another aspect of unlearning the perspectival viewpoint is trying to think, well, okay, I'm working with these photographs that I've taken using a macro lens. How am I going to actually compose this in a way such that the forms could be evocative or recall elements of these Chinese landscapes, but still be true to the object? So yes, there is a distinct sense of connecting to I guess the heritage or the lineage of these Chinese forms that have stayed with me.
Fascinating. I'll go back to Sally. Sally has a question. Thank you, Cindy. I'm so interested in your practice of drawing sound waves of the call of Australian birds. Is there a particular bird that you are more drawn to, and do you draw the sound of chorus birds and at say dawn, or do you listen for one particular bird?
Oh, well, that's really interesting. Because I feel like the sounds of places, they determine my interest. So, for instance, when we were living in Roseville, there was a particular bird at a particular season that would call just before 6 a.m. And I drew that sound because you would hear one calling to another. And the sounds of magpies were also a piece that I had done. But often because they're so intermingled in each place, it's quite rich, a soundscape when you start listening. You would end up with a multitude of different birds in the one image. So unless I had captured a recording with just one particular sound, it would be rare that there would just be one bird that's a focus. But in terms of one of my favorite birds, I have to say, Australian magpies are really wonderful. And then also butcher birds. They have particular calls when they want food.
I will ask the last question. Time is gone over, but I have to ask this question. It's fascinating to see the transformation of from where you are so sensitive to the sound, to the shape, to the the women washing clothes and all these little details in actual life, and then come to the end of your artworks. It's just amazing. Even like the garments of your grandma, we saw the garment, but then see your artwork. It's you see the connection, but it's also surprising. Just the corn you just showed us. Yes, we see the corn, but when you get to show us the drawing of the corn, wow, when is that a long process when you see and when you come out with your artwork? It's a long process, or when you see it, you actually in your head, the artwork will be like what?
It's a very long process of development. So for the drawings of my grandmother's garments, I think it took me about 2 to 3 months of sitting with it, looking at these, and because I hadn't drawn textile patterns before, I had to experiment a lot, and I knew 100% that I wanted to use Chinese ink and brush in some way. But I also knew that I needed to use pen to achieve detail. So marrying those two was quite difficult because when the ways that I had drawn or had been taught to draw, contouring, creating planes, different tones, was mainly through charcoal. And if you think about Chinese painting with the brush, all of those aspects and the contouring and rubbing back, that doesn't happen. You know what kinds of strokes you need to use. There's a training in that. But I needed to figure out how to do this using the brush and also using different paper. So I didn't use Wenzhou paper like I do for my scrolls. I used a French watercolor paper that is really robust. But the marrying and intermingling these mediums that were not made for each other was really quite difficult. And I needed to actually experiment with that for several months before I could actually make it work with the image. So even with these now, it's going to take me a little while to try and work out, well, do I actually want to do some soft diffused ink within this that I hadn't used in the textile pieces? So this will also take some experimentation as well. I think it's always important to go with to listen to the work and to let it take you where it wants you to go. Sometimes I feel like I need to allow myself to be the medium for the work to emerge.
I now so get to understand what you mean to let the work lead you. So, from what you have described. Cindy, we can't thank you enough for this really fascinating, all of us, all the audience is fascinating. It is a fascinating talk. And not only we see a lot more of your own work, we also see the world, different way, through your eyes and through your sound sensitivity. It's just really fascinating. Thank you so much. And we're so pleased that the last talk of this year ends with you. And it's really the best and a wonderful ending talk of this year. So thank you, Cindy. And thanks to all the people who are listening, and we'll turn this into a video and upload on our website.
Thank you so much, Professor Han.